Hi, everybody, and welcome to Flame Tree Live and Spooky. Today's panel is Drawing Inspiration from Real Life Horror. I'm Tim Waggoner. I'm going to be the moderator, and I'm going to introduce you to our panelists and read their bios, and then we're going to jump right in and start talking about scary stuff. Let's see. First, I'll just go by the order that they're on my screen. There's Catherine Cavendish. Following a varied career in sales, advertising, and career guidance, British writer Catherine Cavendish is now the full-time author of a number of paranormal, ghostly, historic, and gothic horror novels, novellas, and short stories, including 3 novels with Flame Tree Press, the latest of which is In Darkness, Shadows Breathe. Her leading characters are frequently normal, everyday women to whom extraordinary things happen and happy endings don't generally occur. Well, it is horror, isn't it? So, and next is J.H. Moncrieff. She primarily writes paranormal mysteries featuring ghosts. She travels to the world's most haunted places for her research, and The Restoration, her latest release from Flame Tree, was inspired by a ghostly event she experienced. Well, that sounds pretty cool. You have to tell us more about that. And then sharing a screen is Melissa Prusi and Stephen Hopstaken. You're the co-authors of the Stoker's Wild series, which is awesome, which features Bram Stoker and Oscar Wilde battling vampires and other supernatural beasties. Stoker's Wild and Stoker's Wild West are available now. And the 3rd book in the series, Land of the Dead, is coming in April 2022. And like I said, I'm Tim Waggoner. I've published over 50 novels of dark fantasy horror media tie-ins, and I also teach creative writing at Sinclair College in Dayton, Ohio. So when I first got the topic for this panel, I was like, oh, real life horror, that could descend into some very dark areas depending on what we talk about. And I came up with some questions that don't shy away from that, but I'll be interested to see where our discussion goes. Before I came up with a new question because all the questions were sent to the panelists ahead of time. But one of the things I was thinking of is the times when I've taught horror literature classes. It's often that I seem to have about a 50% split in people who prefer supernatural horror and people who say, no, that's too out for me. I got to have real life horror. Why do you think that is? Why do you think there is that split? We'll start with Catherine.
Thank you. It's a difficult one. I think it's what we gravitate towards. I mean, I gravitate towards the supernatural horror because what I want to read is more on the escapist side, perhaps. So whereas something could be coming in from real life, like it could be a life-threatening illness, it could be a disaster or a catastrophe happening, it is kind of one step removed when you've also got ghosts in there or a witch in there or an Ouija board or things moving in the darkness or something dreadful lurking in the cellar or creeping down from the attic. It kind of keeps you away from the really nasty real life and allows you to still maintain a reading experience which is in the realms of escapism. And I think I write what I like to read. That's what I like to read, so that's why I write it. And I think that there is a definite split, that there are people who would much rather concentrate on the real life horror and they're not fazed by that. They actually, that's what they want to read. They don't need the escapism or they don't want to.
Okay. Melissa, I saw you nodding your head the whole time Catherine was talking. So what do you two think?
Yeah, I'm in exactly the same boat. I kind of prefer the more supernatural. I don't have to worry too much about it. I don't really believe in vampires, so it's perfectly safe for me to get scared by vampires in a book. Ghosts, I'm on the fence on, but those are a little safer too. Whereas, reading about a real life serial killer or something along those lines, that can happen. So that hits a little too close to home.
Yeah, Stephen, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. I think sometimes real life is just too scary, and so going into, and it's also the survival aspect of it. If you read a scary story and you survive it, you think, well, I could survive something scary happening, horrible happening to me in real life too.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, Holly, should I call you Holly or JH? What do you prefer when we're doing panel?
Probably JH for the
right, JH.
To not confuse things, because if you search for Holly, you're not going to find too much.
Well, that's true. So thanks for telling me. All right, JH, what do you think?
Well, I'll go on the other side as someone who's in a true crime show. I should say something for true crime. So I've loved true crime since I was a little kid, which probably explains a lot about me. And I know a lot of people who love true crime. Obviously, people who follow the show will contact me and so forth. And it seems to people love it because no matter how bad your life is, as horrible as it sounds, someone else has it worse. Like it's almost comforting in a way, right? To know that, well, your life is really bad, but it's not as bad as this person's. So there's that. And there's this weird sense of security. I noticed with true crime, there's an awful lot of victim blaming, which I don't agree with at all. But people seem to have this idea that they would be different, that they would be smarter. Sorry, I've got a cat who's chiming in. But people seem to, should I just wait to her to finish?
No, that's okay.
Slowly.
She will have her say.
Because the guest appearances by pets and kids are the best thing about Zoom. So
Well, and I
awesome.
actually have a live and Spooky too, so Spooky might show up. I don't know. But anyway, so with true crime, I think there's some victim blaming where people think that, oh, they would have been smarter, they would have done the right thing, they wouldn't have walked down the dark alley, they wouldn't have worn that thing, they wouldn't have done, you know, there's a lot of picking on women, unfortunately, in these genres, but people get the sense of security that, oh, that wouldn't have happened to me because I would have locked the door, I would have locked the window. And I think that's why a lot of people are drawn to it. There's just something about true life stories that really titillates people. Not that I mean, obviously I love ghost stories too, but there is something about that real life edge that really hooks people.
That's
I wonder if
interesting.
people,
Go ahead.
sorry.
No, you go ahead.
I wonder if people think that that it's a life lesson to read the true crime or to, like, you know, get some tips about, well, what can I do to protect myself in the future?
Yeah, I was going to say that I thought it's really interesting. It never occurred to me that people were doing that kind of sort of, imaginative interaction, almost like choose your own adventure. You know, what would I have done in this case? Which you can do with any kind of a story, but I think it, true crime probably lends itself. I always had the sense that people were really fascinated by trying to get into the mind of a killer. Like, how could somebody do this, or how could this happen? Where, you could try to do that, I guess, in supernatural horror, but it's kind of a given, in a way, with supernatural horror. It's just, supernatural stuff is there, it exists, and we just run into it. And maybe there's, especially like in a haunting, there might be a reason for it, but it's not as compelling in some ways if you're really drawn to why these things happen. Because a long time ago, I used to think that maybe people who, they said it had to be real world stuff because other stuff's too far out. And I'm just like, oh, well, I guess their imagination isn't that strong. But, as I've gotten older, it seems like it's just a different way of exercising the imagination. So, well, I think it was Catherine who was talking about that kind of buffer effect that you can get with the supernatural horror. Does that mean that if we think of horror as something that, is going to be emotionally harder hitting, horror is the name of the genre. Do you think that then real life horror, at least more elements of real life horror, make for stronger horror than supernatural elements? I mean, is the buffer a bad thing in terms of just like, really good horror fiction?
I think in some way, it's a difficult one, that, because for me, yes, the buffer is a good thing. I think the best thing I do is really illustrate it with an example, actually, from actually it's a book that's come out most recently for me from Flame Tree Press, In Darkness Shadows Breathe. There is a character in there, Nessa, she's one of the two main characters. And Nessa and I have a lot in common because she and I both share the same cancer, or shared the same cancer. And so I put her through the same operation, same diagnosis, same operation, back to being in hospital for a few weeks, having a wonderful team around her, a wonderful husband, etc. All of that I shared with her. And then, of course, along comes because it's a supernatural horror, I have the ghosts and the haunted hospital and the portal that takes Nessa into an older version of that hospital where terrible things are going on. And I give her all this supernatural stuff to deal with. And so the story is very much on, yes, it's a woman with cancer, but it's the supernatural thing that is driving the story and what happens to her supernaturally, if you like, as a result of her experiences. And I think when it comes to something, a real life horror thing like cancer, I mean, cancer, the big C, it's still a big taboo. It's still the diagnosis we all as human beings fear whenever we find something that shouldn't be there or whatever, and we go along and see a specialist. And so I think if I'd written Nessa's story without the supernatural elements, it would have been, first of all, it would have been obviously a very different story. But secondly, it would have also been one which I believe readers, a lot more, many more readers would have found very, very difficult to read, because I mean, the nature of the cancer, it's vaginal cancer. The nature of the cancer itself, the operation that she had, the focus would have all been on that real life horror journey that she was having. And I think it would have been very, very hard for people to have read that, even if I said, well, no, this is a novel. This, you know, Nessa doesn't exist. This is made up. But the supernatural, that buffer, means that you can read that and you still take one step away from the actual diagnosis, if I'm making any sense there. And you're not having to deal with her cancer in the same way. You're dealing with the spirits and the demons and, come on, Nessa, you know, get out of there. So
that's a great example. So JH, you got a foot in both worlds. What do you think about do you think that the real world horror based in the real world is more powerful ultimately than stuff based in the supernatural world? Do you think the buffer is good or bad, or is it just good sometimes and bad sometimes? What do you think?
Well, for me personally, when I write, I found like I've tried so hard to just write a fun ghost story, but I always need to bring it back to the real world. I always need to anchor it somehow, because especially with ghosts, to me, they're a history lesson in a way, right? They're teaching us the sins of our past. So I always need a reason for them to be there. And I think that makes it more powerful. But Catherine, you know, she's talking about the buffer, but one of my favorite books of hers is Pendle Curse, which of course, so one of the reasons I really love that is because of all the true history behind it. So it's almost like you have that buffer, but then if there's some real world in there too, you have the buffer, but then it doesn't really let you have that comfort. It's like, oh, it's just a book. Oh, wait a minute. Maybe it's not just a book, you know? So I kind of like that juxtaposition of, yes, you have the buffer, but do you have the buffer? Right. So, I mean, look at all the horror movies that are based on a true experience or inspired by true events and how crazy they get. There's that, it's like we want the buffer, but we also want that fear of maybe the buffer isn't really there. Does that make sense?
Well, it makes perfect sense. And I can see, you know, and I can remember being in theaters and the people in front of me or behind me be whispering, this is based on a true story, you know. And they did that at the Blair Witch. And I'm like, no, it's not, but that's okay. Believe that. If it helps you, you know, think it's more awesome, you get into it more. That's great. But that's a really good point. And it's simple. We should all do that. Just put based on a true story on our books, because it's just, you know, just based, put it in quotation marks. Listen, Stephen, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's, you know, that's a really good point. And you look at something like The Conjuring, which is, you know, they're real people, and allegedly everything that's happened in those movies has at least some basis in truth. Obviously they change a lot to make it more plotty, but it gives you a little bit more of a thrill, I think, to think, okay, something like this at least happened to somebody, and it makes it a little bit more visceral.
And especially, I think, putting real world elements even in a fantasy can kind of pull that fantasy back. I mean, one of the reasons that Dracula was so popular with Victorians is Dracula was in their streets and riding their trains. It was modern to them. People think of it as a Gothic horror, but it's really one of the first modern horror stories. And it really terrified people, especially with this allegory of disease and, you know, foreigners coming in and things like that. Stephen King does this a lot in his books, where he sets it in the real world, so it feels real. People are listening to the music you listen to, and, you know, using the products you're using, and it feels like this really could happen, and take some of that fantasy element out of it.
Mm-hmm. It's a really good point about Stephen King. It's like you get so comfortable with his world that you feel like nothing, you know, bad could happen necessarily, and then something terrible does, something supernatural does, and it's like he's saying, yeah, your world is not safe. He builds it so meticulously that you become, you know, immersed in it, and then that happens. That's a really good point. Well, you know, those are ways of, a lot of what we've been talking about are ways of, you know, balancing horror, you know, supernatural elements, unreal elements with real elements. That's a little different than drawing on, actual crimes or actual horrible things that have happened in history. So do you think there's a good reason, creatively speaking, for writers to draw on like a murder case or a missing persons case or something like that, or even just in general like that, to either, base a big chunk of your horror on, even if there's supernatural stuff, or literally it's just going to be about a murder? So let's start with Melissa and Stephen. You guys haven't got a chance to go first yet.
Yeah, I think that it can really help the reader identify if it's something that they know has happened. Things like Ed Gein in Wisconsin has been the basis of so many horror characters, from Norman Bates in Psycho to I think Leatherface in what is it, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. That if once you know that, you can kind of start to see the threads, and it can get you down a wormhole of okay, well, let's look into the real guy and see how closely he compares.
JH, what do you think?
Well, I think truth is stranger than fiction, right? So I think we're inspired by what's going on around us and what's happening in the world and what's happened before. And it's natural, I think, for us to grab onto some of those stories and weave them in. Like, to me, one of the most horrible things in the world would be to have someone you love vanish and not know what happens to them. And that happens all the time. So many people go missing. So I've always been drawn to those missing person cases, or like I said, ghosts, had the history. You only have to scratch the surface a little bit of any country, even the most beautiful, idyllic ones, to find something horrible and tragic that happened there, and then build your ghost story or your witch story or your Dracula story from there. So, I mean, even Romania, right? Speaking of vampires and Vlad, I mean, there's lots of real life horror there.
Yeah, I remember first time learning about Vlad the Impaler, and I'm like, suddenly Dracula does not seem to, but he bothers a few people in England, and then they just chase him and they kill him. It's a lot different than his warlord and the thousands of people he may have butchered. So, Catherine, what do you think?
Real monsters are harder to kill too.
Yeah.
It's people. You can't use a silver cross or
Right.
Spain or whatever to keep them back. They're real people. So.
Right, and there's an endless supply of them. There's only so many vampires in the world. So, Catherine, what do you think?
I think there is a fascination with certain crimes that just never goes away, because I think there are some crimes that are just so awful that real life crimes I'm talking about now, that we really can't understand and fathom how on earth a human being could do that to another human being. And I think that's why you tend to find so often the same mass murderers repeated again and again, either factual or fiction. I mean, one that just immediately always springs to mind is Charles Manson, and obviously the Tate LaBianca murders back in 1970, wasn't it? Now it's over 50 years ago. I mean, you had this sort of apparently idyllic environment, Laurel Canyon and all around there in the late 60s, peace, love, flowers, man, absolutely everything you could ever want, except that it wasn't like that. You had this man who had connections in the music industry, yeah, but they didn't want him because he wasn't very good. But he sort of went to the nth degree and developed a family, and we all know the story of the Manson murders. But what we still can't fathom is what on earth made him do it in the first place. What? And however many documentaries, however many films, however many books are written, we still can't get over, I think, our fascination for what makes some of these people tick. And not just that, how they can draw others into their web, as Manson did, and others have done before and since, and no doubt will in the future. How other people can be so drawn in. And I think the most recent fictionalized account of Manson murders that's sort of out and about there now, Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which draws on that and mixes fictional characters with Manson and various other things that's going on there. And I think Tarantino handles it actually very well. I'm not a massive fan of his, but I think he handles it quite well in that film. And I know it's not horror, but it sort of presents facts, mixes it up, but again, it shows it just isn't going away, that story. And neither is the story of Ted Bundy, and neither are other stories. Because we just cannot get to grips with how on earth such a thing could actually happen in an environment like that.
Yeah, it seems
Look
like.
at the Ripper.
Go ahead,
Who's been-
Melissa.
Look at Jack the Ripper, who's been people have been fascinated with that case for well over 100 years now. And maybe the unsolved nature of that has a lot to do with it. If we knew who he was definitively, maybe that would get boring, but hasn't so far.
Right. Yeah, because there's so many killers that I'll read about sometimes, and I'm like, how come this isn't a bigger story? And for whatever reasons, it just seems like some get mythologized and some don't.
Mm-hmm.
And some seem to lend themselves to being like an equivalent of a monster. And still very real world. But I mean, even Hannibal Lecter, I mean, he does things that serial killers can't do. Like he somehow can keep his pulse at a level when he's like engaging in, ultra violence, which a body can't do. I don't care what you do. You start moving, your pulse goes up. Not him, because he's like, supernatural to some level. Even in Jaws, they do that. No normal shark would do this. So there's still that hint somehow of the otherworldly that's in there, I guess. Maybe kind of a sort of a liminality where it's kind of like a little bit of a crossover, just maybe a little bit. So how real life is too real life for horror fiction? I mean, when people talk about like the most brutal kind of real world, real life based novels, they talk about Jack Ketchum's The Girl Next Door based on a real case. And I was scared to read that book for a long time. I was like, this thing is good. I know it's based on reality. I know that Jack's going to go, unblinking into it. I'm not sure I can handle it. Eventually I did read it. And I guess that I've been exposed to so many things since it came out that it wasn't as bad as I thought it would be, or else something's wrong with me at this point. I don't know. But we risk maybe on some level turning people away. I mean, there are people that won't read extreme horror if it depicts things that the violence and the aftermath of violence or the cruelty and just the way it really is. No cutting away, no closing your eyes. So I mean, when does it get to be too real? And when does that become something that, practically speaking, as artists, it turns our audience away? JH, what do you think?
I'm just speaking from my perspective. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but for me, if I'm going to tell a story about something horrible that's happened to another person, like those who came before, is all about real things that happened to Native Americans. It's not, that particular thing maybe didn't happen, but all of those things did happen. So in my case, I always use sensitivity readers. I think that's really, really important. And that helps. And also to tell it from a good place, to know why you're telling it. I didn't tell that story merely to entertain or to shock. I told it because I heard so many people had no clue that this happened to Native Americans or Native Canadians for that matter. So there was a real drive for me to tell that story for a reason. But I think if you're just doing it to shock, that could lead to backlash. But the readers seem to be very smart that way. They can usually tell the difference. I'm glad you brought up The Girl Next Door, because I read that and it's almost exactly to the word, to the detail, the case. Like there's very little embellishment, very little creative writing in there. It's pretty much the case. And I was kind of wondering how he kind of got away with that too, because there wasn't really a lot of embellishment or creative writing to it. It was the case, and then this character that didn't really exist in the case. But I had that question as well.
Yeah, I bet he got away with it because there was no social media for people to seriously, immediately compare it to the case and talk about it and argue the ethics of it. So yeah, but it's scary to think about how much he stuck to that, and for reasons like you were saying, there's to talk about how can people be this cruel? How could this possibly happen next door, as opposed to this is really going to, mess with your brain and you need to read this and give me money, which is, not what he was trying to do. Catherine, what do you think about that? How real is too real?
I think too real can be one. Well, for a start off, I agree very much with JH that you've got to be sensitive. If you're dealing with, for example, basically a true story, and the people involved in that story people who were victims are still alive, or maybe their children are still alive, or maybe people who survived, against all the odds, they survived that horrific whatever it was that actually happened. If any of that is true, in other words, if the story is basically still current in some people's lives, then I think you're treading on very, very dangerous ground altogether. And I think you've got to be particularly aware of that. I've not read the Ketchen book, so I can't comment on that at all, but this is purely my own perspective. I think that you've also got to be aware that some things, that we're writing fiction. As horror writers, we are writing fiction, and that there is a line between fiction and fact, and sometimes it needs to be really firmly drawn. One thing that sticks in my mind of sort of reality is going to Austria, as I've done on many occasions, going into the military museum in Vienna and seeing how children in Austria, and it's the same I believe in Germany as well, are taught about the Holocaust, and they are taught with no holds barred, nothing left out, no sanitation whatsoever, and that is real horror. Now, the minute you start to put that into a fictional context, then I think lines start to get blurred in people's minds, especially impressionable minds of whatever age or whatever. And I think that is very dangerous ground. And I think we need to be aware that there is a line between fact and fiction, and sometimes you have to draw that line, and you have to take a sensible approach. Say, okay, yeah, I could get a lot of books sold on this, but yes, is it actually the right thing to do, or are you in fact trivializing in some way something which is so awful, so horrendous, and needs to be taught as history rather than as a bit of entertainment?
I never thought about that before, but I can see how if somebody was writing about the Holocaust and they said, oh, it was because Nazi Germany they were all possessed by demons, and it like lets human beings off the hook. And even if nobody's going to believe they literally were, probably, you're right, it still distorts, the reality of that in a way that you wouldn't want to do. So that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Well, Melissa and Stephen, what do you think about the one's too real life?
Yeah, when you start to glorify violence and not show the pain, it's like the old days of movies when people would get shot and you didn't see the pain that the person felt from being shot and how traumatic that really was. That's almost worse than describing it too much, or books where it's just solid violence. It's just there to titillate. It is not really trying to tell a story or to improve the human condition.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that, and I think the points Catherine was making about history are really important to think about, and especially more current history. You have to really think about the people for whom this isn't a story. This is something that really happened to them or their family, and think in their position, how would you want that material to be handled? And I think we still have the right to fictionalize things and to make a story around something, but do it in a way that's not going to cause the people who are involved, any more pain than they've already been in.
Because we steal history in our books, so
Yeah.
I mean, we are definitely stealing history in people's lives, and I mean, even though they're long dead and historical figures, there's just an ethical dilemma there sometimes.
Yeah, I'm more likely to take, because I try to take my horror, which is very dark fantasy, but then also like weave it with very real world things for all the different reasons we've talked about up to this point. But I try to take generic things like JH was saying, there's a missing persons case. What would that be like if you lost somebody? And then instead of basing it on any one particular one, I'll go ahead and try to just imagine myself in that case, and use that. That works a lot better for me. I don't know how I'd feel about taking an actual case, especially if people were still alive, even if I fictionalized it, knowing that, there are real people out there. I mean, do we, any of you have limits for stuff like that? Oh, my cat's about to make an appearance, I think. So there's my cat. She just decided.
Mine's been banished.
Her name's Banshee because she's so loud. But At least she's not too loud right now. Do you have any personal limits? Anybody just jump in here in terms of like places you won't go? Like, for example, years and years and years ago, back when the first wave of Horror is Dead happened, I thought, well, I'll try writing a suspense novel. So this is like in the 90s. And I was watching a documentary with a serial killer, about serial killers in general, just to kind of get a feel. And there was one killer they interviewed who was talking about this boy that he killed. And he said, I kind of felt sorry for him. And there was nothing in that man's eyes or voice. And I was like looking at a pit that I did not want to look into. And I said, I'm not writing, I'm done. I'm not writing this book. I don't want to go there. I'll think of something else to write. And so, for me, I found a limit, to try to imagine or even on some level, maybe empathize with that level of darkness. Yeah, and I didn't go anywhere near that kind of thing. So is there anything that you've been, in terms of like real life horror that were for you is just, whether it's ethical or emotional or whatever kind of limit that you might have in terms of what you'd explore in your fiction? Like I said, anybody can just jump in.
Okay. Certainly in my case, I wouldn't go anywhere near torture or killing of children or animals. I just draw the line at that. I just can't handle it, particularly cats. That is definite boundary. Another thing I definitely wouldn't touch is cannibalism, and I'm not talking about the situation where somebody is kind of forced into that. We have well documented cases, real cases of people who've crashed on mountaintops or whatever, and they've ended up, it's like, okay, somebody's died, what they're going to do, bury the body or actually survive by eating. That's a different thing altogether. I'm talking about the wanton type of cannibalism. I'm just not going there at all. It's not my kind of thing. So yeah, it's basically children, animals, cannibalism. Those are definitely areas I wouldn't touch.
I think I would tend to shy away from any story that was specifically focused on violence towards women, just because I think we've had plenty of that.
Yeah.
And we've also had plenty of stories where the women then turn the tables, and that's great. But I just feel like at this point that just has been such a weight on our society for so long that I think I would not particularly want to delve into that.
Okay.
Having a trope,
Yeah.
and it becomes lazy writing too, when it's like, oh, we're going to show how bad this character is by making him a rapist or something. It's been done so much that it just doesn't mean anything anymore.
Right. JH, what about you?
I'm the same as Catherine. No animals. No animals will be hurt in my writing. I can't make the same promise for children. I have had the odd child suffer in my books, but no animals. Although this did bring up something for me, though, that I've noticed as I blog about true crime cases, and like Catherine was saying about people who are still alive. I did one that was like way in the 50s. This girl died in the 50s, and I didn't even think, because I was still fairly new at this. And her family, her nephew, wrote me, commented on the blog. And thankfully, they didn't have a problem with it. But what people would tend to do is they'd write in and they'd have their theories, and, oh, I bet this person did it or that person did it. But families of those people would comment. And that's when I really realized, okay, so now I always have to put in this disclaimer that please realize that when you're commenting on this blog, that this is a real person. They had loved ones. The loved ones might be reading this. They might comment. I mean, it sounds stupid to say I wouldn't have thought of that, but it just, when you're writing about a case that takes place in the 50s or the 40s, you don't expect their nephew to find your blog and be commenting on it, but they do. Welcome to social media.
Yeah.
When you read things like that or watch them, they don't have those kind of disclaimers. So when you're using models, for how you're going to approach that, yeah, it didn't surprise me at all that you didn't think of it. I wouldn't have either. But I think it's really wonderful that you do that, because it just is a nice way to remind people that, this is real stuff, and empathy is not a bad thing, a bad thing to have.
And any victim blaming BS gets deleted right away. I won't have any of that. I can't stand that. I just can't stand it.
Well,
Awful.
Yeah, when it comes to the trope of violence against women, one of the things I do is try to reverse it so that it happens to men in like a similar situation. I don't know if anybody's ever noticed, but I'm like, this is my way of kind of like at least getting a little kind of balancing a little bit, or getting people to, when they read, just to kind of even unconsciously kind of compare to what they've read before and how they feel about it. It makes me wonder if there's a reason why people feel a need to blame the victim, almost like they do want to make the perpetrator almost like a hero, kind of like they're the protagonist of the story somehow. I don't know. It's just it happens so much, and I don't understand it. Maybe we'll have to explore it in a story to try to figure out a little bit more about it. One of the things that I was going to ask is, do you think there's a chance of traumatizing people by using elements of real life horror? I mean, do we need to be careful? But JH, you were saying that you use sensitivity readers, and some of the others, you've also mentioned kind of being sensitive to that. Do you think it's for people who want to use real life horror somehow, whether it's just inspired by or thinly veiled or whatever? Do you think it's something we need to worry about? The idea that we have to tread carefully because we might traumatize some readers?
I feel like there are definitely people, everybody's on, it's a spectrum, right? So a lot of people want more extreme horror, a lot of people don't. And I think to a certain extent, it's on the reader to understand what kind of book they're picking up. Hopefully the description or any reviews would give you a hint of what's coming. If it's very extreme, I would personally think there's nothing wrong with a content warning, just so people don't accidentally pick up something that's going to be too much for them. But I think it's up to you and who you think your reader is.
You're seeing a lot more in reviews and trigger warnings and things from the readers, telling other readers. I just find it really interesting. It's like happened so much now that people say, oh, dog gets killed in this, or
Well, there's a whole website, I think, does the dog die or something like that, where people will log a wide variety of content warnings. So if you can take a look and see what you might be sensitive to.
Yeah, those are my favorite kinds, the ones that readers do or viewers in terms of movies do for each other. Because as a writer, what do I know how this is exactly going to affect a variety of people? I can say the story has this element in it, but somebody else can say this element is treated this way and it created this effect for me, and it might for you too. And so I think those are the best, beyond whatever I could possibly come up with. But Catherine or JH, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I agree, Tim, because I do think that everybody has their own level, their own, if you like, trauma level, above which or beyond which they would rather not go, and that can occur in all sorts of ways. I mean, I just particularly do not like anything with spiders in it. Now, I can be traumatized by a large spider in my bathroom. I can't help it. I stand there sort of shivering, shouting for my husband to come and rescue me from a blooming spider. I mean, and I write horror. So it is very difficult to know what would traumatize your reader. Only readers know what traumatizes them. I don't have anything against trigger warnings. I think, they have a place. And I certainly wouldn't complain if Flame Tree started putting trigger warnings on my books. I don't know what about, but they're welcome to do it if they feel it's appropriate. But as for me, I honestly wouldn't know where to draw that particular line, because I know I don't write /gore, put them in a category type novels, and I think readers of my work know I don't. Occasionally I will sort of surprise them by putting a gory scene in, and sometimes I get a sound for doing so, but I only do it if I feel it's absolutely essential or correct for the storyline. But then for the one person that's doing that to me, I've got 10 people saying, oh yeah, it's really good, that, because I've got real feel about how bad this character was. So it's very very difficult for us to police our own work, I think is what I'm saying. I think we do need help, and the readers are the best people, really.
Yeah. JH, what do you think? Are your sensitive readers a help with this?
Well, unpopular opinion, I'm not a fan of trigger content warnings. I'm going to be the outlier. One of the reasons I love this genre is we have the freedom to go dark. And I just think that readers should on some level expect that it's not going to be a happy sunny story, and police themselves in a way, right? And I think horror already has such a big stigma against it. There's so many people already that go, I don't read that, without even knowing what that is. They just think Friday the 13th, that must be horror all the way across the board. And that putting trigger and content warnings on it, it's just another reason, and just giving people another reason to go, oh, there's a rape in here, oh, I won't read it. Well, maybe it's like really essential to the story, and it's, you know, it's a beautifully written book and it has all this message and moral behind it, but they're going to see that trigger warning and go, no. Thrillers have lots of that stuff in it, and I've yet to see a thriller with a trigger content warning. Maybe they exist, but I've yet to see it. So yeah, I don't like the way this is trending, where absolutely everything that isn't sunny and rainbows and hearts and flowers has to have a warning attached to it now, but that's just me.
Well, that's why I like if people are going to do it, to have a website where you can go, you know, if that's your choice and that's what you really want. Usually and I think Stephen said this, that traditionally for me, if anything like that is going to come about, for me, it's through reviews. You know, I'll read a review of something and I'm like, oh, this sounds like it's a really good book, but I'm kind of aware that this darkness might be in it. So, you know, I'm prepared to read it. You know, at this point, maybe most of my life, I just dove in, and if something happens, last time I was reading a Richard Lehman book that I had never read before, and a serial killer is about to kill an animal on the way out of town, and I just had, you know, several pets die in a row. It was pretty awful. We had 3 of them die in a row over the space of a month and a half for different reasons. And I'm like, you know, no pet killing today for me, thank you, and I'll just come back to it later, maybe someday. So, you know, the thing that I also worry about with trigger warnings is, does it make people say, oh, I can't do this because my books won't sell, and then they don't write the story they really want to write. You know, if you just say, okay, fine, I'll do something else, and you're fine with doing that. But yeah, when it makes the artist already kind of self-censor in that kind of sense, it just makes me wonder if they're limiting themselves. But I do think about, you know, regardless of what elements are in the story, I want it to be for the readers a positive experience, even if it's darkness. I know people who aren't horror people don't get this. I can't explain it to them, that, you know, why horror can be comforting to us and why it can, you know, give us so much and ultimately be a positive thing. But I do think about that. I personally try, just in ways of doing it, is I try to make it either slightly unreal, or, you know, I don't make it funny or anything, but ridiculous in the sense that, you know, it's like my wife used to be an EMT, and if we watch any, like, you know, gory movies or whatever, she'll like laugh because she goes, that's not the way it works. Real life is so much worse than this. Or, you know, the blood is extra red, so it doesn't even look like real blood. I mean, there are ways that you can kind of give your readers some tools to help them, you know, distance a little bit without probably, you know, diluting the actual impact. So if you are going to be using like real life horror, or elements that are very real life, like a, you know, realistic kind of wounding scene or whatever, what are some of the techniques that you use to do that?
But with me, I kind of, and this probably will sound bad, but I don't want to pull any punches with most of my books, because I'm trying to let people know about something tragic that happened to a group of people, like Catherine, you know, referenced the Holocaust, and I haven't gone there. But the last thing I want to do is be like, well, wasn't that bad? This massacre in Bali wasn't that bad. Look away, look over here. So I've kind of got to go there, but I have a sensitivity reader, and I usually dedicate that book to whoever suffered and whoever helped me do the sensitivity read, and that's what I do. That's a technique I have, and I tell it with sensitivity. I tell it for a reason. It's like, hey, you guys going to Bali to just hang out and chill on the beach? There's a darkness there that, you know, has let you have this great vacation experience. There's more to this than you know. So if I was to pull back from that, I think in a way that would almost be more harmful or worse.
There are ways you can still be descriptive. You can still let people know what really happened, without getting so into the weeds that it becomes painful to read. Sometimes I think you can have something start to happen and then cut to the character reflecting about it later, and you can tell that there's a trauma around it without necessarily getting into every detail of the trauma. But in a way, it gets back to what Steve was saying earlier about, you know, they show the gunshot and people barely bleed, and they're back fighting the bad guys again in 5 minutes. That's that's not really giving you, giving the weight of something like that happening to somebody either.
And by pulling back too, that's what trauma victims do as well. They suppress it. And so you can get a feeling for the suppression that's happening too, and get probably more into the person's psyche than if you were to describe in great detail what happened.
Okay, Catherine?
Yeah, I think I've done both things really. I think I've, depending on the story and what I felt was the way the story was going in my head or where the characters were taking it, I've both pulled my punches and sort of basically put a scenario out there and let the reader imagine what has happened. And the reader, obviously, sometimes or frequently, what you imagine is far worse than anything somebody could ever have actually written. So I've let that happen, or engineered that to happen. And at the same time, I've also, Pendle Curse is actually one example where there are some pretty violent scenes in there. But bearing in mind it was taking place in the 17th century in England, it's kind of, and there was a lot of torture going on there of adults. These are adults, by the way, not children or animals. There was a lot of racking and stuff to get confessions to witchcraft. That was going on, and it was appropriate for a couple of my characters to actually go through that because they had to react while they were being tortured in that particular way. So that's one of the examples, the few examples really, where I got really quite graphic or very graphic. Too graphic, one or two people have said, in my writing, but I felt it had to be done that way. Other times, I just feel the need to set the scene, paint a picture, but leave some bits out and let the reader do the rest of it.
Yeah, the guidance we use is to stay in the person's head, to stay in the character's head, because the pain happens to someone. As opposed to when you watch a movie, you're a passive observer, completely removed, and you may think, oh, look at all that blood spray. It's so ridiculous. It's so funny. And there's no sense of who that person is. Plus, if somebody's going to be like somebody who just is on stage for a short time before they die, I always make sure to try to paint them as much as I can as a real person in the time that I have. So, well, we're just about at the end here. So you want to go around and tell people where they can find you on the web and if you got anything coming out. So we'll start with JH.
As a matter of fact, I do. I have a book coming out October 26th from Flame Tree called The Restoration, and it's inspired by true events. It really is, by my staying overnight in a haunted house and what happened there. So excited about that. And you can find me just JH Moncrieff. If you Google me, I'm pretty much everywhere, including TikTok.
Very cool. Melissa and Stephen.
Steve-Hopstaken.com is our website, but also Stoker's Wild on Facebook and Stoker's Wild on Twitter
and Instagram.
Not in TikTok yet.
Get on that. You need to get on that. Catherine, how about you?
Well, I'm catherinecavendish.com for the website, which I try and keep updated. In Darkness, Shadows Breathe is the latest one out from Flame Tree. That's been out a little while, but it's one I was talking about earlier with Nessa in it. And I'll be having 2 more books coming out from Flame Tree in 2022 and 2023, respectively, one of which is set during the Second World War.
Well, you can find me at timwaggoner.com, 2 G's and an O, and that has links to all my social media and everything. The book I got coming out on the 26th is the novelization of Halloween Kills. So I'm very excited. I haven't seen the movie. I just know the script. So I'm excited to see the movie and excited to find out what people think of the book. So, well, thank you so much, everybody. This was a wonderful discussion. And thanks to everybody who watched us on Flame Tree Live and Spooky. Everybody wave goodbye.
Thanks.
Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.